In a stunning, patriotic, and encouraging development, liberal Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson signaled public support for Supreme Court reform, including a binding code of ethics. And in her answer, in a roundabout way, she threw shade at her corrupt colleague, Clarence Thomas. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to talk about in this video. This is very encouraging. If you follow this channel at all, you'll know that one of the theses of Pondering Politics is that the United States Supreme Court is problematic, to say the least. This idea that we have three co-equal branches is nonsense. We don't. Congress was supposed to be the most powerful branch, according to the founders, then the president, and then the Supreme Court was supposed to be the weakest and least dangerous. Powerful? Yes. Important? Yes. But not the de facto boss of our constitutional republic, which is effectively what we have today. We have a Supreme Court that can strike down presidential orders and executive orders, that can strike down congressional laws, that can effectively give orders to the other two branches. And yet, because Congress is so paralyzed and the president is so deferential to the Supreme Court has no checks against it. It can dish out checks and balances to others, but is never really the recipient of any. And as a consequence, when you have 9 unelected lifetime appointees who are effectively above the law and accountability, it tends to give rise to some of the most corrupt, baser instincts. And we see that particularly with right-wing justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. Fortunately, we have good people on the court, good jurists with, who are truly ethical, like Ketanji Brown Jackson, who was appointed by President Biden to the bench. And she was interviewed by CBS, and she weighed in on a number of issues, including the Trump immunity case and, just the state of politics in terms of the upcoming election. But most importantly, in my opinion, she weighed in on Supreme Court reform. And Justice Jackson seems to very strongly support it.
Be necessary.
Today, fewer than half of Americans say they have a favorable view of the Supreme Court. Pick your reason: the partisan confirmation battles, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, or undisclosed trips and gifts given to justices, including Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas.
By one analysis, Justice Thomas has accepted around $4 million in trips, travel, and gifts over the past 2 decades. Is that inappropriate?
Oh, I'm not going to comment on other justices' interpretations of the rules or what they're doing.
What's your personal code of ethics?
Well, I follow the rules, whatever they are, with respect to ethical obligations. And it's important, in my view, to do so. It really boils down to impartiality. That's what the rules are about. People are entitled to know if you're accepting gifts as a judge, so that they can evaluate whether or not your opinions are impartial.
The president wants
that answer alone, let's just focus on that for just a second. Again, she was very diplomatic. Oh, I'm not going to personally weigh in on the particulars of another justice's situation. But note how she answered. She does follow the rules, suggesting that Clarence Thomas doesn't, and indeed he doesn't. She also says that the rules are important because they speak to impartiality and the appearance of impartiality. A judge, it's entirely possible, I suppose, that a judge is so superhumanly ethical that they can engage in what may appear outwardly to be corrupt or nefarious activities, but be so pure inside that they not let those activities color their judgment. But we as American citizens have absolutely no reason to trust that that's the case. That's insane. And that's why so many judicial rules at the federal level, and even the Supreme Court Code of Conduct, which Chief Justice Roberts reluctantly created in November of last year, they speak about the appearance of impropriety because they at least understand, hey, our legitimacy comes from buy-in from the American people. So it's not enough to say, oh, I can do whatever I want, just trust that I'm not corrupt. No, you have to avoid doing things which appear to make you look corrupt and partial. So what Justice Jackson here is saying makes absolute sense. She's like, yeah, impartiality and avoiding questions about impartiality are really important to me, which is why I follow the rules and why I think they're important. So then Norah O'Donnell follows up with a question about President Biden's Supreme Court reforms, which include a constitutional amendment to basically enshrine that no one is above the law, effectively overriding the recent Supreme Court ruling about Trump immunity. We'll talk about that, and she is asked about that particular case in another clip I'll show you, but also term limits for justices, a binding code of ethics. And that last one is where Justice Jackson really comments.
Wants a binding code for the Supreme Court that would enforce gift disclosures and recusals. Do you see a problem with that?
So, a binding code of ethics is pretty standard for judges. And so I guess the question is the Supreme Court any different? And I guess I have not seen a persuasive reason as to why the court is different than the other courts.
Are you considering supporting an enforcement mechanism?
I am considering supporting it as a general matter. I'm not going to get into commenting on particular policy proposals, but from my perspective, I don't have any problem with an enforceable code.
That is so damn refreshing. I want you to think about this. And we're going to play, again, we've got some other clips of Justice Jackson from this interview that I want to talk about. But listen to what she said. This is a woman who is one of the most powerful people in the country, given a lifetime appointment to the nation's highest court, which is in many ways, due to undue deference to it, the de facto most powerful branch, the branch that can strike down congressional law and presidential activity. And she is saying, yes, I want accountability. I understand the calls for accountability. I'm not going to get into particulars because that could be seen as political, but I will not oppose efforts to make this court accountable with respect to its ethics and respect to the sense of propriety. That is so damn refreshing and so counterintuitive to what we see from the modern right wing, the modern Republican Party, the modern conservative movement, and certainly from Donald Trump. And if you don't believe me, consider this. I played this clip in contrast months ago, but right-wing Trump-appointed Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch was interviewed by the Fox Propaganda Network. And during the course of that interview, Shannon Bream asked Justice Gorsuch about President Biden's Supreme Court reforms. And I want you to note what he says and contrast it to how Justice Jackson answered.
You are not in a bubble here at the courts. There are real-world events happening. The president has proposed now changes to the court, supported, it appears, by the vice president, who looks like she's going to be the Democratic nominee. How does the court feel about potential changes, term limits, ethics codes that are enforced by someone in ways that it isn't now?
Shannon, you're not going to be surprised that I'm not going to get into what is now a political issue during a presidential election year. I don't think that would be helpful. I have one thought to add. It is that the independent judiciary means, what does it mean to you as an American? It means that when you're unpopular, you can get a fair hearing under the law and under the Constitution. If you're in the majority, you don't need judges and juries to hear you and protect your rights. You're popular. It's there for the moments when the spotlight's on you, when the government's coming after you. And don't you want a ferociously independent judge and a jury of your peers to make those decisions? Isn't that your right as an American? And so I just say, be careful.
So that was Justice Gorsuch in a roundabout way threatening the president of the United States. Be careful trying to provide checks and balances. Be careful calling for checks and balances. Be careful trying to hold us accountable, because don't you really want impartial judges? And don't impartial judges basically need to be given carte blanche? Don't impartial judges, if you really want an impartial judge, why would you want an accountable judge? Accountability and impartiality are clearly in conflict, so says Justice Gorsuch. That is so fundamental to the divide between these two figures and these two philosophies. Justice Jackson is of the opinion that accountability and impartiality are not mutually exclusive, and that, as a matter of fact, accountability can enforce and reinforce and reaffirm notions of impartiality. Justice Gorsuch says, hey, listen, if you can hold us accountable for things we do wrong, then, oh my God, we're not impartial. It's so mind-boggling and demonstrates the vast philosophical and intellectual superiority of the liberal justices, of Justice Jackson, over the likes of Justice Gorsuch, who really wants to be an unelected, lifetime appointed philosopher king who can dispense rulings from on high that everyone else in this country are bound to. He wants to be God king over the rest of us, which makes sense given when you consider who appointed him, Donald Trump. I also say Shannon Bream, Fox propagandist, she buried the lead quite a bit when she was like, yeah, the president's Supreme Court reforms are supported by the vice president. Yeah, but they're also supported by the vast majority of Americans, according to poll after poll after poll, including most Republicans. Believe it or not, as a general principle, Americans don't like unaccountable political leaders. They don't mind investing temporarily power, immense power, in the hands of their representatives, but there will be checks and balances. That is fundamental to who we are as a country, regardless of where most people are on the political spectrum. You want to be president of the United States, you can be the most powerful person on earth, but there are checks and balances, there are term limits, there are elections, there are legal and political mechanisms to hold the president accountable, or at least there were. It's the right wing in this country that really is so horny for the notion of power, permanent power, ideally to them, with no accountability. And on that subject, Justice Jackson, getting back to her, she was asked during this interview on CBS about Trump v. United States, which conferred sweeping presidential immunity to Donald Trump and other former presidents.
One of the hardest issues the Supreme Court tackled this year involved Donald Trump. The question, could the former president face criminal charges for his efforts to undo his 2020 election defeat to Joe Biden? In July, the court ruled 6-3 along ideological lines that Trump was entitled to immunity for official acts as president. Jackson dissented.
You were concerned about broad immunity.
I was concerned about a system that appeared to provide immunity for one individual under one set of circumstances, when we have a criminal justice system that had ordinarily treated everyone the same.
Are you prepared that this election could end up before the Supreme Court?
As prepared as anyone can be. Let me ask.
Yeah, and she's clearly hoping to avoid a Bush v. Gore situation where somehow this case winds up in front of the Supreme Court. Donald Trump attempted to make that happen in 2020, hoping that the then conservative majority, supermajority, would turn in his favor. And it was one of the few fleeting instances where the Trump appointees, the three of them, and their three conservative counterparts already appointed, resisted efforts to throw the election to Donald Trump. But the bottom line is this. I'm really encouraged by what Justice Jackson said here with both answers. I'll also say that her questions in Trump v. United States and her dissent, separately written from Justice, I think it was either Kagan or Sotomayor. I think maybe it was Sotomayor. It was Justice Sotomayor who wrote the first dissent, and then Justice Jackson had a separate dissent under it. It was incredible. It really was. I mean, this idea, it's so grossly un-American. And again, my frustration is born from the fact that I would feel this way about no matter who was asking for it. If a Democratic president, if Joe Biden came out and celebrated Trump v. Anderson, because of course he benefits from it too, all presidents do, I would be disgusted. I would be appalled. And the fact of the matter is, that the same MAGA Republicans who celebrate, who are again so horny for a God king who can't be held accountable, they would be apoplectic. They'd be frothing from the mouth if Tansu Dijon mustard eating President Barack Obama demanded the sort of presidential immunity that Trump demanded. They'd be flipping out, and rightly so, because it's gross to think that our nation's chief executive wants to become a monarch. We revolted against a monarch 250 years ago, and that was right then. It's right now. And instead, because the Republican Party has mutated into an authoritarian cult of personality, they are gleefully willing to cast those American values aside on the altar of Donald Trump. So I love everything about what Justice Jackson said here. She was very polite against Justice Clarence Thomas when she, I suppose, didn't have to be, but she chose to again pursue her ethics. But she made it very clear that she is appalled by his behavior, and she does support a binding code of conduct, which in and of itself, again, is extraordinary. This is a person being handed enormous power by her appointment, as all the other justices are, and saying, actually, there should be more checks on me and my colleagues. I have this enormous power, this enormous privilege. It would be so easy to just try to shrug off any sense of accountability and do whatever the hell I want in this position. And instead, I say I should be held more accountable, and so should my colleagues. Great stuff, encouraging stuff. This is what America is all about. We need more justices like Ketanji Brown Jackson. Love it. Let me know what you think in the comments.